Divine Set 3, when announced, honestly looked like a pretty sleeper set, but after all the cards came out, it ended up being a lot more impressive than I expected. So today we're going to go over my first impressions while looking at the full card list and take a look at how things actually ended up being. Before we get into the video, I would like to ask you to check if you're subscribed to the channel, and of course, also a reminder that if you want to support the channel, you can become a YouTube channel member and get access to a lot of extra areas in my Discord and a lot of bonus content on this channel too, such as first-person POV fights for all the new decks that aren't even out in English yet. I've uploaded quite a lot of them already, and generally speaking do upload at least once a week for these as well, so there's quite a lot to be gained, so your support is very much appreciated. But with that, let's get into it and talk about this new set. There's honestly a lot to unpack here, so we're going to look through each of the nations separately. There is no lyrical in the main set this time, but there is a new collab that is in the set that we don't know if it's coming to English yet or not, but I would kind of assume that it will since we got Hololive, as it is another VTuber agency, and this one is very famous in Japan, not so much yet in the West, but this could be one of their, Western marketing strategies. But anyway, let's take a look at Dragon Empire first, and this is honestly where my high expectations for this set already kind of begin with Shoujo Doji. So I already made a video talking after the Shoujo Doji reveal happened that I was quite impressed with this card, and honestly, I'm even more impressed after talking to some of the players that use the deck and also, about the multi-attack potential of the deck being, way more than 4 or 5 attacks. But basically, Shoujo Doji got reimagined with a new grade 3 that now allows you to bind 3 of your stealths from your soul, and then you choose 2 of your opponent's circles and bind anything that is on them and force your opponent to bind a card from hand, and then they normally get them back at the end of the turn, but you have a bunch of effects that either like bot deck your opponent's bound cards or put them to drop. So Shoujo Doji is positioned pretty well in the current meta where there's quite a few defensive decks running around. It's mostly Luar that is the main kind of proponent of those defensive decks, so it's a really good matchup into that. And also Shoujo Doji by default, thanks to its ride line and also the support that is splashed into Shiranui, is really good at early game. So any decks that are slower or decks that are kind of easily lose tempo thanks to early aggro are going to have a pretty rough matchup into Shoujo Doji, as it is a multi-attack as well as some defensive capability, although I'm not sure how much you'll use the defensive skill of him, where when he attacks or is attacked, you can put 2 rearguards to soul to choose 2 bound stealths and then call them to guardian circle or front row, back row, or rearguards in the same column. So I feel like you don't actually build the bind zone as much because of the fact that you want to be calling them to rear most of the time. So I was almost hoping for a bit more support that would bind stuff from drop to bind or something like that. But even without that, I think that it's still a pretty good deck, and also the fact that you can bind your stealth PG is also pretty good. So for that reason alone, I think Shoujo Doji is pretty good. His support is also very nice. Like I've talked about this in quite a lot of depth already in a separate video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Goti Blaze, the new ride line, I'm a little bit still doubtful on. There is the promo that comes out in the new volume of the manga itself, Youthquake, that kind of helps this deck, but I'm still not sure even with that if it's going to be that great. It feels like the setup for this deck is just a bit too difficult because you have to set up basically same name cards in soul with what you want to restand. So if you want to restand your Vanguard, you have to have 2 of your Vanguard in the soul. If you want to restand your rears, you have to soul blast the same name as the rears that you're trying to restand. So it does feel like the setup is pretty difficult for this deck, although a lot of the parts do help you achieve it. So I feel like I'm going to leave it up to the people that are into figuring this deck out and see if it actually has that much potential. But for now, I think from the new ride lines, this one I do rate the lowest. In terms of legacy support, we have a really good Vermilion card. This basically fixes the issue that Vermilion had where it would multi-attack with Rising Phoenix, but the Rising Phoenixes will be really small. This basically gives them at least 5k as long as they are this guy's behind them, and also the fact that if your Vanguard is hit twice or more this turn, which can be counterplayed, you get to give plus 10k instead. So basically Vermilion skill hits the Vanguard at 1 other rearguard, then you get to activate this plus 10k buff, which is really huge, and it also allows you to essentially Energy Blast 3 to draw a card too, which is just really good. So I think this card is like a must-have for Vermilion, and it basically makes that whole deck very good all of a sudden just from 1 card. And again, another good card like to well-position Vermilion in a meta that is quite board-based. So quite a big fan of this guy. In terms of generic cards, there's really not much for Dragon Empire outside of like the generic grade 2 that all of them had. I broke this down in a separate video already, but they're basically like, if ditch from hand, if your Vanguard is grade 2 or greater, Soul Boss want to call this, but if you called it during the battle phase, they can't attack, but then they usually have an effect that lets them boost from the back row, so usually they can be used for that on the turn that they're ditched. And then a lot of the other cards are basically support for the decks that are in the set. There's a normal order that lets you counterblast to 1 and retire an opponent's rearguard, and if your Vanguard is a Thunder Dragon, you bind it instead. There's a few like order zone based decks that are supporting like the triple drive booster guy. I think every nation got one of these commons that's like, if your Vanguard is the same or lower grade than your opponent, or if your damage is 4 or more, it gets 5k shield and 5k power, but they're 8k grade 2, so I'm not really sure what they're trying to do with these. I think also this is basically like, what is it? Fushimachi Madoka, but on a common. So it's like a Rearguard Guardian Circle. If your opponent has 5 or more cards in drop, this gets plus 5k power and shield, this time on an 8k body, so it's a little bit better. But other than that, a lot of the support in this set for Dragon Empire is just around the decks present. What this does mean is that, for example, you know, Koti Blades and Shoujo Doji are basically just kind of like built within their own archetypes. They don't really need too many generics. And also Shoujo Doji uses energy, so Gun Cyclers already are a bit of a rough match into them. Then it comes down to how much Counterblast you use, whether you want to use the other cost of the Gun Cyclers. But still, for Dragon Empire, I think overall it is kind of docked down by Koti Blaze, but I think Shoujo Doji is a pretty big winner. So I think it gets kind of like an average score of 3 out of 5 for me this set. Usually I record these on my Twitch, but today I'm actually recording it offline, so I don't have chat to try to sway me. I do think the Vermilion support is really, really good, but I think it still kind of scores in average. Moving on to Dark States, however, we have another very much like, you know, heaven and hell levels of power in this set. Venus Lukier was the surprise addition to this set that basically revitalized the Lukier deck in general. She now gives a constant plus 5k to your front row as long as you have a, you know, Lukier in soul and your opponent's on grade 3 or greater. She calls 4 cards at once at the cost of Energy Blast 3 and putting 1 card from hand to soul, and on attack she puts 2 cards to soul to draw 1, get 5k, and then get a crit if your opponent's on grade 3 or more. You still have the 4 attacks that you can do with the original Lukier order, and now you can also use Bubetsu, which is one of the greed-on cards, to also get a 5th attack, but that attack does come from your hand, so you have to always be holding on to attackers in your hand as well. So my issue with Lukier that I mentioned before is that even now her early game is a little lacking. She has some pieces she can kind of throw down early and then just kind of soul in later and not have to worry about it too much. She got this dragon, which is really good, that says when placed on rear, if your Vanguard is a pale moon, you put a card from drop to soul. So the grade 2 that was reprinted in Festival Booster that says when you put it to soul, you bind it and then search your deck for a grade 3, put it to soul, does work really well with this, where you can commit that card early to aggro with, and then you can use this to put it into the soul, bind it, and search out the original Lukier or the Lukier order or any other grade 3s you want to put them to the soul immediately. On top of that, this thing also is a 23k attacker essentially, so it's actually a very, very good rear guard. I would also say that this generic for Dark States is very good, not just in Lukier, but just in general. On call from hand, you energy charge 1, and after the battle it boosted. If this turn you have energy blasted 3 or more for any ability, you can retire it to draw 1. So this again works out pretty well because it retires itself, this dragon puts it back to soul, and then you can call her out with Lukier again. This is also easy to commit early game because your opponent probably won't want to take it out too early. Although if you play Gun Cyclers, energy blast 3 on turn 2, then you get to also use this effect as well. But it's honestly a very, very good card. I mean, it draws 1 without actually costing anything, just retiring itself. So it's kind of like a painkiller angel, but you know, just restricted to decks that energy blast a lot. There's a couple other, like, I mean, this is technically generic, but sort of Lukier support that's not very good. It's just like an extra power gainer and potential soul charger. There are a couple generic pieces in the set too. There is this blitz order called Walk the Dark that you can play from the soul by energy blasting 3, and you give the attack unit plus 15k power, and you can also play this card from the soul, and if you did play it from the soul, then it goes to the bottom of the deck. So it's actually not bad because again, you can search it out in Lukier too, so this could be like a random one of you play just as a defensive option, also good against guard restrict decks. And then the majority of the other cards in this set are basically support for Sacrifice Glass. So I didn't cover this in a video yet, but Sacrifice Glass is an interesting deck where essentially during your turn, every time your opponent's unit is retired from rear or guardian circle, you energy charge 1, and at the end of the battle that he attacks, you energy blast 4 to search your deck or drop for this card, Grand Dogma, and ride it, give it plus 15k and -2 drive, and then your opponent may draw 1. His whole ride line is kind of weird because the grade 1 also lets you and your opponent draw 1. So it kind of, to me, makes it feel like it wants to win by deck out. It's like a stall deck, but letting your opponent draw cards in Vanguard is a very, very dicey effect. So I'm not sure how I feel about it. Grand Dogma herself is essentially end of battle, she attacks, she retires a rear guard, and then if you have 1 or more copies of her in the bind zone, she retires 2 rear guards in total, and if you have 2 or more of her in the bind zone, she stands herself. So you can actually get 3 Vanguard swings in 1 turn. And end of turn, if in your bind zone you have 1 or less of her in your bind zone, then you get to re-ride the Sacrifice Glass from your Soulless Rest and bind her. But so that basically means that once you have 2 of her, so once you've used her effect twice, so basically on turn 5, she will stay on the Vanguard circle. The glass has been sacrificed completely. So the whole lore is that he's trying to like revive her and she's like some crazy devil woman witch. Didn't really read the lore, but she sounds pretty evil. They do have like this support grade 2 that says like when your sacrifice glass attacks, you retire an opponent's rearguard for free, which sounds pretty good. And then when your Grand Dogma attacks, this gets plus 10k. So technically, if you get to use like the full effects, you get plus 20k on this and a retire. Now, what's important to look at is the order this deck has, which is a CB1 that does an effect based on what your Vanguard is. If it's sacrifice glass, then you remove all effects from your opponent's rearguards that are continuous or auto. They cannot regain them, and they cannot be moved from rearguard circle to guardian circles. This also kind of like outs the like hostage builds that use the set order to protect themselves with their rearguards. And then your opponent chooses 3 cards from their, and then your opponent chooses 3 unit cards from their drop, calls them to empty rearguard circles, and then you draw 1 for every 3 rearguards between you and your opponent. So basically, if your opponent has 5 and you have 4, you're going to be drawing 3. But if you have, 3 and 3 each, you're going to draw 2, etc. So you have to keep in mind that this basically lets your opponent get 3 cards on the board, and that's kind of why, for example, this thing is a free retire. That's why she retires 2 for free as well. So that way, the cards that you put on your opponent's board aren't actually sticking around, because if it's me and if I'm playing like, I don't know, if I'm playing Archetype or something, I'm just gonna put down cards that could draw me more cards, right? Or I'm going to put down something that has like a strong attacker or something. So your opponent wants to obviously retire that back, not let it stay on the board. So I think lore wise, it's basically that he's trying to sacrifice a bunch of things to summon her. And so that way you're also like sacrificing your opponent to summon her or something. But then when you play this card and your Vanguard is Grand Dogma, so like turn 5 onwards, I guess, or is it turn 6 onwards? Basically, if your Vanguard hasn't been placed this turn, you activate Persona Ride and then choose 1 of each different grade from your drop that isn't a heal or over trigger and put them back to your deck. So you can put back a 0, 1, 2, and 3. So that means you can put like a crit back or something, which is, I guess, fine. And again, this kind of hints at that anti-deck out strategy I was talking about, or like trying to deck your opponent out by stalling, but I feel like this deck doesn't plus enough to really do that. This thing is also like end of turn Energy Blast 5, draw 1. It also lets you play this order from the drop. And Energy Blast 5 to draw 1, it's actually not that far-fetched in a deck that says Energy Charge 1 every time your opponent's rearguard is retired, and you retire, 2 to 3 a turn. And on top of that, you're also like Energy Blasting 4 for this effect, but this deck does gain a lot of energy. But even with all those things said, it just seems a little bit too slow. And, if your opponent just kind of like doesn't flood the board too much, you're just constantly reviving their stuff. And also I feel like in a meta where Archetype, spoiler alert, is going to be very good and she can empty her drop zone pretty effectively and put into the order zone, I feel like this isn't really going to fire that much either, like the revive 3. So then if they just give you 1 or 2 cards on board and you don't really get to draw much from this, it just feels kind of weird. So I don't know, I honestly feel that this deck is pretty sus. But for Dark States, Lucia is really good, I'd say. Like, she still has kind of the somewhat issue that her early game isn't too great, but her, like, turn 3 onwards, she's hitting for like 30-40k numbers easily. And the generic triple is also very good, and I think Sacrifice Glass, while pretty mid, is, it does reduce the points of this deck quite a bit. But there are some interesting generics here and there, so I'll give Dark States a 4 out of 5. But now the easiest 5 out of 5 I've ever given in history, Brancate this set. Literally, there isn't a single bad foil. Archetype is, in my opinion, going to be a new tier 1. Dayusha stuff is quite good and very reminiscent of the kind of like raw core playstyle of Dimension Police back in the day. The freaking silhouette support is amazing. Dayusha support, silhouette support, generic, that's all the foils. Literally every single foil for Brancate is good. So I've actually been playtesting Archetype quite a lot because we have a WGP this weekend, the day after the set's released, and the deck is really good. Being able to Energy Blast 2 to set up 3 kaijus in your order zone means that if you go second, you can actually afford to Energy Blast 7 to draw 1 first, and then still afford to Energy Blast 2 after that. Her buff effect is that every time you call a kaiju, you can put a same name kaiju from your order zone into drop to give the 10k, so it doesn't clog your deck anymore. This also means that you can immediately put that kaiju back into the order zone with the energy research order. So that way, doing the plus 10k buff, even in main phase, not necessarily in battle phase, is really, really easy. And she says on attack, count +1, call 2 different named kaijus from your order zone. So even on your first grade 3 turn, you are doing 5 attacks. Her buddy, the main kaiju, Revidis, or Davidis, is untargetable by effect, effects, which is also very strong in this format. This means that even Shironui cannot target it, by the way. And when placed by Archetype's effect, he gets plus 10k in a crit if your opponent's on grade 3 or greater, and the effect that when he attacks, you counterblast 1 and give your opponent's Vanguard minus 5k. The issue with this is that this effect only procs on the 4th attack, basically, because you attack with 2 rears, then you attack with Archetype, and then you call this, and only then his effect activates. If you call him in main phase, it will not actually activate, so that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. So he isn't necessarily as good as Obscudate is in terms of like just call by effect, right? So it's a little bit unfortunate, but still very, very strong. Like the minus 5k definitely does come in handy. And the other kaijus in this set are really good too. We have a 10k shield that bounces back to hand if you have an Archetype Vanguard for Soul Blast 1 after it boosts. And the 10k shield condition is if you have 2 or more researches in Order Zone, which is very easy. And this card is in particular very cracked. It is end of battle it attacked. If your Vanguard is a grade 3 or greater Archetype, you can retire it to draw 1. This means it doesn't care about your opponent's grade. The first effect does though to gain the plus 5k. This has to attack a grade 3 or greater Vanguard, and you have to have a research in your Order Zone for it to get 5k. But you basically always want to be calling this just to bash and draw, so this is a must 4 of in this deck. So all the kaijus are pretty damn good. Like Archetype in general just got really good support, and using Sava Ward, you can loop Persona Ride infinitely, which is also pretty crazy. If you see one Persona from your research, you just never need to worry about Persona ever again. Dayusha I've also play tested with a little bit here and there too. I found that the deck is definitely still feels like it's a little bit lacking in terms of like to be a top meta contender, but it probably does rank in somewhere in like tier 3-ish. I think the strength it has is that against decks that don't have countercharge, so things like, you know, Varga just has like the Regulus piece, it is still very good at locking them at 3 and just not letting them do what they want, because you're constantly swinging with crit pressure, which is really nice. You're also constantly drawing cards and giving power to all your dimensional robos, so your field is actually hitting for really big numbers. And he is constantly restanding, so he does have kind of like a divine skill, so you can bind your Goyusha from your soul as long as you don't have any Goyushas in bind zone in order to restand him, and or not restand him, but to give him a extra drive when he restands. Otherwise he attacks with no drives in the second attack. But of course you also have a lot of good supporting rear guards because it is dimensional robos. So this guy basically, when he's played from soul by your effect to rearguard circle, if you have a grade 3 or greater Dayusha and your opponent's on grade 3 or greater, it makes your Vanguard's original critical 2, so that way your 2 swings are threatening for a lot. And he basically from soul allows you, as long as you have a Die Dragon Vanguard, your opponent's on grade 2 or greater, which means you want to go second with this deck. If you have the Goyusha, Dilander, and Die Mariner in soul, which the Dilander and Goyusha are your ride line. Die Mariner basically says when ditched, you put it to soul. So getting the parts is very easy. You get to ride Dayusha from your ride deck as stand, and it doesn't lose drives. The important thing, of course, in this deck is that it does have a set order. So it is a Brancate deck where you essentially get to rest it to energy charge 1 and then choose a dimensional robo grade 2 or lower from drop and put it to soul. But if you set this card this turn, you can search your deck instead. So you can actually deck thin, and because of that, you can actually play specific ratios of certain dimensional robos that you don't necessarily want to have as 4-ofs. So for example, like your Die Dragon is only going to be in the ride deck usually, but if you use it once, so his effect is that, you know, he retires himself to function as a 15k shield, you can then put him back to soul from drop. But then for example, I don't really think you want more than one Dilander. Like you have him in the ride line, you can play like one extra in the main deck just to thin it out, because his effect is when he's placed by a card ability from to rear from soul, he gives himself and your Dayusha Vanguard plus 5k. But what calls these cards is the second effect of the order. So you can Energy Blast 2 and rest this to call a grade 2 or lower dimensional robo from your soul. So of course this lets you call the Die Dragon, this lets you call, you know, the Dilander, the Die Battles, and it's not once per turn either. So usually you're going to be calling out the Die Battles and recycling the Die Battles every turn in order to be able to get the 2 crit Vanguard. On your first grade 3 turn, whether going first or second, you are most likely going to just call the Dilander because this needs your opponent to be on grade 3. So that way you have a bit of extra power. And then Die Mariner seals Intercept and is a 10k. So there's also, of course, Die Lady. She is the searcher for this order, so the ride line also searches 1, but she also CBs 1 to search your deck for a base, and which is the order is a base, and add it to your hand. And when she attacks a grade 3 or greater, if you have 2 or more bases in Order Zone, she gets plus 10k. Don't forget that Heroes recently got a countercharger that works as long as you have a base set, so this also works with Dayusha. So overall, the deck has basically, you can compress with the order up to 4 times per game, This compresses out, you know, basically up to 3 of your orders from your deck as well. You're drawing cards pretty often, so in terms of doing brancate things of deck thinning and winning off of that, it's still doing it. So I think that overall dimensional rolls are pretty solid, especially in Japan where we have diversity cut. This can definitely be a deck that you bring for the diversity cut slot. So it's times like this that sometimes I do like diversity cut in Japan, which is very much not a thing in the West, and I think people in the West would be pretty angry if it was. And then finally, the Silhouette deck got really good support. So they got an arms that essentially lets you soul charge 3 per turn. So on attack, depending on what this unit's circle is, it does the following. So it always chooses an armed arms from drop and puts it to soul, and this deck now is going to use quite a bit of soul. So if he's on Vanguard circle, and if you have 2 or more arms equipped, he will make the Vanguard get an extra crit, and if he's on Rearguard, he gets plus 5k. So he's a 15k attacker that soul charges 1. Then they got this robot, which is a on-call soul blast 1 like a top 7 for 2 different armed arms, put 1 to hand and 1 to drop. Don't forget that your rad line calls 2 armed arms with different names from drop. And then when your Silhouette attacks your Vanguard Silhouette, you soul blast 1 and retire this to basically battle door your opponent. And battle door means that your opponent has to guard with 2 or more cards at the same time. So this card is also very good too. This card maybe is like the worst of them all. It's like a quintet wall essentially, but just these 2 cards alone make Silhouette actually like a pretty decent deck. Plus Silhouette got a promo recently that makes it have 5 attacks, so it's pretty strong just for that, I think. There's a new Blitz order generic that lets you recycle your set orders back to bot deck to get 20k shield, and then there's a couple other random cards here and there that are kind of like generic support. Also, they showed on stream the really beautiful secrets for this set, so especially the Archite is really cool because for like her text is like, let's go to destroy everything, and like the destroy kanji is broken, so it's being destroyed. Then I think the Dayusha secret looks kind of mid. It's just a clan logo with like the clan name on it. I think the Brancate cards look really good in silver rare, so I think silver rares are definitely a good pickup. But I think with how much I've been talking about this nation in particular, I think you can definitely tell this is a 5 out of 5. This is the easiest 5 out of 5. Everything is good. There's literally not a single bad card for, in my opinion, Brancate outside of like maybe a random common. Since we're showing the parallels, I should also show the Dragon Empire ones. I think the secret for Shojoji looks so cool. It's got like the sword has like, it's kind of like a blood style, and also the manga parallels for Koti Blaze as well as the Stoichia rad line look really good too. For Dark States, there is of course the Lukier. So there's a Lukier secret, again kind of boring looking, it's just the logo, no alternate art or anything. And then the Sacrifice Glass, I think the blue kind of like doesn't look, it's kind of hard to read in terms of like the color contrast here, so kind of wish they went with a different color for it. But anyway, now let's talk about Keter. So Keter also has a new rad line that is the undercover one. I talked about this already in quite big depth in a video, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but basically it is a multi-attack deck that deck thins and it resembles only assassins from Buddy Fight. One of their supports, Data, she essentially is an on-call counterblast 1 if you have a undercover Vanguard or Shadow Paladin Vanguard. You look at top 5 for an undercover card or a Shadow Paladin clan card, which of course lets you add Esras as well and add it to your hand. And when she attacks a grade 3 or greater, if your Vanguard is an undercover or Shadow Paladin, soul boss 1 get 10k. So 20k attacker that also adds Esras to hand is pretty good. And the generic for Keter is kind of weird. It's like a melty. So when placed on rearguard circle in main phase, counterblast 1, choose a card from hand that is grade equal to or lower than your Vanguard and call it. And if you did, you draw 1. So it's literally melty, except this gets plus 5k if your Vanguard is grade 3 or greater and if you have 4 more units. So this is something you can just kind of like chuck into some of your decks, I guess. And like, I guess it's an addition to the pile. So I think overall, like these two are like not really, this one's not really generic, but it's like Luard and PBO support. So for that reason, it's already, you know, 3 different decks that can be used in. Young Obscudate, of course, this is Obscudate of the past, is an undercover support, so he is a back row attacker, so you get to do 5 attacks in this deck essentially. He also does a drive check. There's really nice support for Genesis, so for Minerva here, finally a deck shuffle way, and also some Azel support too. This one essentially Energy Blasts 3 to look at top 3 and then call a card to an empty rearguard circle, and then at the end of turn that card will go to bot deck. So just a board filler, you know, it's also an energy user, so it's pretty nice. There's this interesting rare that's like on attack to Vanguard Energy Blast 3, retire one of your other column rear guards to draw 1 and get 10k. So this could be useful in something. It sounds kind of interesting. Like just being able to convert like grade 3s off the board, or like, you know, in decks where they will self-retire anyway. This could be an interesting card. This is the undercover kind of like set order. There's a new normal order as well that lets you, if your opponent's on grade 3 or greater, Energy Blast 2, look at the top card of your deck, put it on top or to soul, and give your Vanguard plus 5k for the turn. I could see this being use in some things just because it is a like turn-wide 5k and also a top deck checker. And other than that, everything else is basically just like undercover support slash support for other old ride lines. So I think we've covered most of the main ones. The secret is just the Mordalion, so the undercover Vanguard, which I do think this deck is going to be pretty cool. So I'm actually quite excited for it. I don't think it's going to be like a top tier or anything. It's probably going to be also like tier 3-ish, kind of similar to Dayusha, just because it is like multi-attack and deck thin, but the power is basically just provided by him. Like, of course, Obscurate buffs himself because he attacks from back row. But aside from that, I feel like a lot of the numbers in this deck are just like 5k increments here and there. So we'll see how it kind of like stacks up. The deck not having any countercharge is also a little bit unfortunate, so you do have to run some generic counterchargers in a deck that really doesn't like generics. So for that reason, I do think this deck should be pretty cheap outside of maybe this card. This card's price will entirely depend on if she is used in Luard or not, I think. So Keter, for me, honestly, it's above average, so I think it's a 4 out of 5. Like, there's nothing bad here, I would say. Everything is like decent or better, but nothing that like screams like, oh, this will be meta. And then almost last, we have Stoicheia. So Stoicheia also has a new ride line with the Sutra orders. So these are, I think, the most interesting part of the deck, especially this one is an order that you can play if you have the Stoiraja Vanguard. You give your opponent the effect until the end of their next turn that their Vanguard loses 3k. So this also applies during your own turn too. So you attack your opponent on a 10k Vanguard, even if they're grade 3. And you can Soul Blast 2 to draw 1 if you played another Sutra order this turn to give your opponent another debuff, which says your opponent's Vanguard loses 1 drive. So even if they re-ride, even if they stride, doesn't matter, it will have 1 less drive, which is brutal. So I think just this card alone makes me rank this deck pretty highly. This card itself basically just does 5 attacks while buffing your things, which is pretty good. This guy is quite interesting. He is a defensive option that when your Vanguard is attacked by opponent's rearguard, you can retire him to choose an opponent's rearguard and decrease its power by its original amount of power. So it's a very cool defensive option. There is a generic, which is the Arvina. She's when placed from hand outside of battle phase, Energy Blast 3 to either get an order back from drop that is not a Regulus piece or revive a grade 1 or lower, which of course lets you revive PGs, which works with a defensive order from Festival Booster, and she's also basically a 10k booster. So she's a good generic card, I would say. There's some good Maelstrom support, which is basically like an Obscudate and Combine Rusher in one card. And then the Misty Arc support. I talked about this quite a bit, but I think Misty Arcs, I completely forgot the promo for Misty Arcs is actually a 5th attack. So this deck has 5 attacks and hand ripping and more power now, and also Battle Door. So I feel like Misty Arc is a deck that should be tested against just because it does sound like it has quite a bit of potential. Other than that, there's a lot of good generic pieces and of course support for this ride line in particular. Helps you find the orders. This guy is a top 7 order searcher. He gets plus 5k for every order you play, so he's a 20k attacker. This thing is also like a top 7 searcher after the battle the attacked or boosted. So there's a lot of different ways, and it also provides soul. There's a bit of token support too. This like Canvas 1 calls 2 plant tokens. I like the art of this peanut. His name is Shaky Peanuts. But I do think that for Stoicheia, the most like, it's honestly pretty good, right? You have a new ride line that looks to have good potential, and you also have a generic triple rare that's pretty good too. So overall, I think it's pretty nice. The only thing is people aren't really sure how good this ride line will be. The legacy support is also really good. So I think it's kind of hard to give it a 5 out of 5 just because I don't think this ride line will be like top meta like I think Arcite will be. And then just while we're here, I will show you the alternate arts. Of course, we have the parallel Stoiraja, the manga parallel Luffy stands no chance to our Bug Lord. So I think the deck is really interesting, but I will give Stoicheia a 4 out of 5 as well, just because I think the card quality is very good. Honestly, I think we can actually give Stoicheia a 5 out of 5. Like, I think the card quality overall is very good. There actually isn't a single bad foil. You know, it's only time will tell whether this deck will actually be good or not, but I think even if it's not good now, all it takes is like 1 card of support for this card to be very, very meta. I think it just might not be very popular, which might be why people don't judge it to be very strong, but I do think it does have a lot of good potential. The only thing it lacks is early game. And then finally, outside of, I guess we should talk about, there is two very important cards in this set. One, there is a triple rare reprint of Ladder. So this card isn't like a special reprint or anything. It's not an RE, it's just a regular triple rare in this set, which means that it will be the same pull rate as all the other triple rares. So you expect to get like, 5 to 6 to 7 copies per case. So finally, Ladder should go down in price. This card is very, very important, and it's kind of weird that they put such an important Regulus piece in a, very low stocked reprint booster. So thank God, very good Bushiroad. You did it well. This one's a very, very important one. And then they also did a new double rare Regulus piece, which is a Blitz order that is basically a 10k shield. And then it says that this has a auto ability, and the continuous ability says that even if during this game you've used the Regulus piece, you can still use the auto ability. So the Regulus piece rule is that you can only have one in a deck and you can only use one per game. So this doesn't mean you can play another Regulus piece, so calm down. But this does have a drop zone effect that says when your unit is attacked, you can remove this from the drop to give the attacked unit plus 5k for every single one of its grade. So if you're a grade 3 Vanguard, this gets plus 15. If you're a Grifogia, this is plus 55. But I think overall it's just a good defensive Regulus piece. So if you're not sure what Regulus piece to play in some of your decks, especially rank 8 decks where it's hard to play normal orders, this is a really good addition. I think this Blitz order is actually quite legit. You do want 10k shield quite often against random attacks, so it's good to ditch for that. And then you want a 15k shield against something else, and there you go, you can use it there too. Also wonder if some of the grade 4 decks, I think 4Bidol is a bit hard to replace, but maybe for Prison, where 4Bidol isn't as good, this could be the Regulus of choice. And then finally, I already talked a lot about this in my previous video we did on the set, but Vispo. So this is the collab set, or the collab of the set. If you don't know what Vispo is, they are a famous VTuber agency in Japan that apparently is launching an English version of their agency too. These are their famous VTubers. I do watch one of them, but she is not a card unfortunately. But basically they split them into 3 rod lines. So you have the Dragon Empire one, which is Emma, which is a restanding Vanguard that basically builds the bind zone while drawing cards and gains a crit once you have 10 or more cards in the bind zone for your opponent or if you Persona Road. And then they each come with an accompanying rear guard that calls a grade 1. So in the Dragon Empire one, you have Toto, who when you call her either CB's 1 or Energy Blast 3 to call out the Gonzales. And then they have effects that basically help the deck. So this one, for example, helps you bind stuff. And they are all dual nations. So you can either build them as just Vispo, so that you can mix all of these together, you know, so like the Lyrical one or the Dragon Empire one and Dark States one all in one deck, you know, it's a happy family. Or you can build them with just that nation. So if you want to build her with, you know, Dragon Empire cards, then you say that you're playing the Dragon Empire version of this deck. So then you can only include these two, you know, the Dragon Empire cards basically, but then you can include other like generic Dragon Empire cards that will help this deck. The best one I do think is Benny, the Dark States one. She is essentially like a better Barrow Magnus. She puts a minus 5k debuff in your opponent's Vanguard for every 5 cards in your soul, so this can easily hit, you know, minus 15. And if you have 10 or more soul, it also puts the opponent's rear guard to soul 2. And when she attacks, she counts 1 and then does things based on how much soul you have. So if you have 4 more soul, she calls a card from soul to rear. If you have 9 or more, she gets a drive. And if you have 13 or more, she gets a crit. So it's really good that she calls a card from soul because her partner rear guard is Noah. When she's called, she calls out the Roro. Roro is this bear who says that at the end of the battle, he boosted Noah. He puts himself and Noah to soul to draw 1. And he also puts a card from drop to soul when he's placed on rear. So that means you can basically do 4 attacks, and this also gets plus 10k if you have 2 or more Rotos in the soul. So you're making a 28k column very easily that can keep on swinging on your opponent's debuffed Vanguard. So whether you build Vispo on its own or just Benny in Dark State, she'll be good regardless. And I think if you are building pure Vispo, it's going to be Benny as the main Vanguard, I would say. But her gaining drives and extra crit too is just, you know, even better. I think the one that has potential is the Lyrical one, Luna. She basically lets you play 2 orders per turn as long as your Vanguard opponent's on grade 3 or greater, so it's a go second deck. And then she lets you soul boss 1 to get top 7 for an order, and when she attacks, she counts 1 to bounce your rear guards equal to how many orders you play this turn and then call that many. So she can do 5 attacks pretty easily. Her partner rear guard is Sumire that calls out Poyaneko, which is this bear over here. That basically after it boosts, it lets you put her and the Noah to soul to get a normal order back from drop to hand. It's also 10k shield, which is pretty good. And then she essentially is a 5k gainer and also lets you countercharge 1 if you play 2 or more orders this turn. So you're constantly countercharging, which is really good. And their ride lines kind of just like work to support what the decks want to do. If you do choose to play the, you know, the Vispo oriented deck, then they have their own effect PG, they have their own OT, they have their own effect crit, effect draw, effect front, regular heal as well. And you also have 2 orders. One of them is look at top 5 for Vispo added to hand, but keep in mind these are just Vispo nations, so you can only use these if you choose to play the Vispo nation deck itself. And then this order lets you soul charge 1 if you want to, and then give your Vanguard or one of your units plus 5k, and end of turn discard 1 to get this order back to hand. So I do think that overall the only deck you want to build with just Vispo is probably Benny. This one is better off with Lyrical stuff because Lyrical generic orders are really good, and this one is better off with Dragon Empire because otherwise it's pretty hard to build 10 cards in bind zone. So do we give a rating to Vispo? Not really, it's not a regular nation, it's just a collab, but I think it's a very interesting collab, and the decks, like the arts are all original arts and they're all drawn by Vanguard artists, so I think for that reason this is probably my favorite one so far. Not a single one of these is stock art, like they are drawn by famous artists. Like this is Gavriel's artist Fuzichoko. They also drew like Olivia. They've drawn a lot of Vanguard art actually. I don't think I need to even begin, but basically all of these artists are very famous ones that have drawn, you know, original art for each of these decks, right? Even their ride lines and everything too. So I really want to support this collab, and I really hope that it comes out to English soon too. The only screenshots are basically the triggers and stuff, but these are screenshots from the trailer that was made specifically for the Vanguard collab. So these are technically also Vanguard art because all these outfits only exist in Vanguard. So yes, I have high hopes for this to come out in English too. But with that is basically it for this first impressions of set 3. As you can tell by how much I've been talking, I'm very impressed by this set. I think it's way better than I first expected, and I think a lot of people really feel the same way. Set 4 is going to be on for a while now, as we have Lyrical up next, and that's going to be, you know, just kind of like hit or miss depending on, you know, how strong they decide to make it. But so far, the card design team has been doing such a good job this year that I'm honestly excited for whatever they have to show for us this year. And then set 3 will be the first one of the not faded ones, the destined ones. So we'll see what they have in store for us there. And we also have a big product stream in 2 weeks time, so they'll probably show us more about that during that stream. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. I know it's a little bit long, but my first impressions tend to go on for a bit long if I've actually researched the cards and tested them and thought about them a bit more than for 5 minutes. Let me know your comments and what you think about this set in general in the comments below. And of course, if you are not subscribed, please do subscribe and become a YouTube channel member if you want to support the channel and get access to bonus content while you're at it. With that, that's gonna be it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.